Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Redeemer Lutheran Church Bible study on the book of Romans. Today, Romans chapter 13, a shorter chapter, but does contain a lot of, I won't say unique information, but pertinent information for life as Christian people in a secular world. I'm Pastor Eric Kleinschmidt from Redeemer Lutheran Church in Highland, Indiana. If you would like to see last week's study and track all the way back, you can start that process by following the link up above to see last week's study on chapter 12. You can also just go right to our page and check out the playlists for the Roman study, as well as others, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs. They're all there. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you can see whenever one of these videos is released and you can continue to study along with us. Today, Paul is writing to the Romans about obeying the government. So it's going to be primarily focused on obeying the Roman government. So we're going to talk about some of the emperors. We're also going to look at what Jesus has to say about all of this and what that has importance for us today. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 13 begins, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Okay, so let's unpack that for a second. First, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. This means people who have rights in the Roman Empire and those who don't. It also means people who agree with the way that things are going with their government and people who don't. The rules apply to all of the people who are there, okay? So you don't get to exempt yourself from the government for your own made-up reasons, okay? You are free in most places to leave that government and go to another place, but you don't get to just say, well, I don't agree with this administration, so I'm not going to obey the speed limit. It doesn't work that way, okay? So let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God. So one of the things that God cares about, and if you want to understand really the Bible and how it affects us in all that we do, you have to understand that God is a lover of order. God does not like chaos. God actually likes and prefers order. He prefers order in our social structures, in the family. He prefers order in our communities, which is why there's government. We're going to see how all this has to do with the fourth commandment. He actually even prefers order in our universe. I don't know if you know this, but the second law of thermodynamics, often referred to as entropy, states that within a closed system, something that is in order will move to chaos, okay? That it'll become more disorganized as time goes on. We see this. I like to use the analogy of if you went to McDonald's and they had 2-for-1 Big Macs and you ate the first Big Mac, but you're like, man, I can't eat the second one. And on your way home, you stop and you walk out to the mailbox to get your mail and you put that Big Mac on top of your mailbox, but then you got some nice letters, so you start opening that and you forget about that Big Mac on your mailbox until, I don't know, 3 days later in the hot sun. Okay, that Big Mac just sitting there does not become more delicious and better for you nutritionally by sitting out in the world for 3 days. Okay, it doesn't work that way. Instead, it begins to decay. It'll be torn apart by wild animals. It moves from a highly ordered state. I don't really eat Big Macs, so I don't know that it's the 3-tiered bun with and the special sauce, right? So it has this highly ordered state as it's prepared, but as time goes on, it becomes more disorganized. Well, the same thing happens with your body. That's why things are breaking down. Your cellular structure is breaking down. The same thing is happening to your car, especially if you live in the Midwest where we have salt in the winter. It is rusting. It is moving from a state of highly organized structure and form to dust, which blows all over the place. So that's actually a law of science, one that we judge things on, and yet the very existence of what we have violates that law. We believe that an explosion, I'm talking as a scientist here who would buy into the idea of the Big Bang. So we're told to believe that this explosion produced complex order, planets orbiting stars, gravity, time, me talking to you, evolution. It's all kind of in there as to we move from a state of chaos to this highly ordered state that we observe today. It violates the laws of science, which is one of the reasons why I don't accept that explanation. So God loves order. He takes what is disordered and he puts it into order. He does that in our universe. He does that in our own bodies. We're complex organisms. He even does that in our family. We are biologically wired to have parents that then raise children, and therefore the parents have more authority over what goes on in the family, because they must, in order to prepare the children to be adults on their own, because of the state that infants come into the world. They cannot defend themselves. They cannot make good decisions. Your teenagers still can't make good decisions, so don't let them decide not to go to church because they're teenagers. We biologically know that their brains aren't capable of making good decisions, so we still need to make decisions for them. Boys until they're like 25, right? And girls a little bit less, I believe. But we are meant to have order in the family. We are meant to have order in the church. So even in the church, you have pastors, you have elders, you have deacons, you have this organization within the church. We see that from the book of Acts, even as Peter and James are in the Jerusalem church and Paul is brought before them to determine if he is in line with what Jesus meant them to teach, or if he is part of this chaotic dysfunction. And so even in the church, there is order. And then also in society, there is order. There is a government. There is a structure based to look at how we live our life together. And we need that because, well, people are evil by nature. And if we are left to our own devices, we'll drive 50 miles an hour through a school zone because, well, I'm in a hurry. And I will take what I need rather than pay for it because, well, I can. That sinful impulse is within everybody. So there needs to be an order that checks that, okay, through the threat of punishment, maybe also reward. But that is how we are wired, and that is a necessity because of sin. Everything in a family cannot be equal. There needs to be a person that is responsible in the end for when parents disagree, and you certainly can't let children make all the decisions for everybody all the time, especially important ones. If hey, what should we have for dessert? And the child says ice cream. Okay, fine. But if you're trying to determine where you should live, and the child determines that we should live in a tree house, you don't go, oh, okay, that's great for our family of 6. Come on. So just because we would find that ludicrous in the family, we can also find it ludicrous in society and also in the church. Don't forget that. There needs to be an order because our sinful nature is always selfish, and selfish people living together is not a good combination for anybody. All right? So we need to check and balance that. God does that through providing structure and order on those systems, and he does that from creation on, okay? So the governing authorities are there because our God loves order. He wants worship to be conducted orderly. He wants things to be sorted. He will judge the living and the dead. He will separate sheep from goats. That's order. God cares about order, all right? So there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Notice that it doesn't tell us what type of government, a monarchy, right? A democracy, a constitutional republic, a socialist representation. Doesn't list that. I do believe that our form of government here in America is the best thing available. I do believe that this is the best country in the world. Proud to be an American, love my country, absolutely. But I don't believe that God ordained democracy or constitutional republic, as we have in the United States, as the only or the best form of government, okay? He doesn't mention a form of government outside of what he sets up for Israel, okay? But in the New Testament, there isn't that. My kingdom is not of this world, Jesus says, right? He is not set to be an earthly king, and he doesn't endorse that. So human beings are free to organize themselves and govern themselves through a variety of different systems and structures. But the desire for order needs to be there. And these governments, no matter what they are going to be corrupt because, well, they're affected by sin and they're staffed by sinful, corrupt people. But yet we still need order. It's still better for us than if we didn't have it. Okay? Okay. So God institutes order. We're not specified what type through any of this. Verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. All right? So if you work against the governmental system in your family, in your church, or in your community, you're actually sinning against God. Now, which sin is it? It's fourth commandment, okay? If you are Lutheran and you remember your explanation to the fourth commandment, it includes not only honoring your father and mother, but all those in authority over you, from teachers to pastors to government officials, police officers, things of that nature, all right? Because the government system in our communities, in our nation, is an extension of the family, right? The church order is an extension of the family as well. That's why some traditions call pastors father. It's a spiritual father, but we are a family of faith. All right. So everything that we have comes from the first governmental system that God gives us, and that's the family. All right. And that's why the family is so important. And that's why with the breakdown of the family comes a breakdown of society. Okay. That's a different video for a different time and a different channel. But as the family breaks down, so does the society around it. Okay? Process that one for a while. So if you're resisting that, you're breaking the fourth commandment. Okay? So we get into the question of when is it okay not to obey your government? It's a question that my confirmation kids have all the time. And the answer I give them is when your government, whether your system, whether that be your elected officials, whether that be your pastor, whether that be your teacher, whether that be a parent, if they command you to sin, then you do not have to obey them. You can respectfully deny what they're commanding you to do and resist. You will incur judgment for that. Don't expect that you will not get arrested, that you will not be punished, that or anything along those lines. There might be consequences that you have to suffer, even unjustly. But in terms of your relationship with God, if they're commanding you to sin, you must obey God rather than men, okay? So in the book of Acts, the disciples are commanded by the authorities not to preach or teach or even talk about Jesus the Christ. What did they do? As soon as they get out of jail, they go right back to doing it, right? Because we must obey God rather than men. Where this came to bear for a lot of us was during the COVID restrictions. As we tried to figure out, well, what authority does the government have to regulate what we do here in this building? And different churches, I would say every congregation answered that question differently, okay? And I give a lot of grace to a lot of different places because nobody knew what to do, all right? We had no idea what we were facing, and we all had different governments in our states proposing different restrictions and things like that. We had to debate things that would be the best for our people. And we had a lot of good leaders in our leadership here at Redeemer that helped us navigate through that. Do I think that we made all the right decisions? Of course I don't. But do I believe that we made the best decision? We did our best in each time, in each context? Yes, I did. The one thing I do regret is that we received like Monday, Thursday, so it's a Thursday for Easter Sunday, restrictions from our government that were governing how we had to do communion in the car, and that people were supposed to bring their own elements, bread and wine. But then they go, oh, well, you can't have wine and drive, so you have to bring grape juice. Well, that goes totally against our confession and understanding of our faith. So we knew from the get-go, we're not doing this car communion nonsense, okay? But it was like churches shouldn't have anything in person. Well, we had been doing a lot of mini services started with individuals, doing 12 communions every hour with individuals, and then family groups, 2 or 3 people. And then we moved to when it was like 10 to 15, and then to 25, and then eventually back in the sanctuary. I do regret closing and not having open service on Easter Sunday. But we didn't have a whole lot of time to even discuss that. And some of you know we still had service. Some of you know that I was still here because you came anyway. But we try to obey the government where we can, but there are times when it seems to overstep. Okay. So knowing when and where that is and that line is can be difficult. And if you do cross that line, you must be prepared to suffer the consequences, even if those consequences are unjust in the eyes of God. Okay. That's what the Bible sets us up to do. So anyway, this chapter in Romans was probably more in use during COVID than at any other time in modern church history, I would say, because we all went to it to try to figure out how to handle these restrictions. And we answered things differently. And by God, give people some grace. Nobody knew what was going on at that time. It's been years now. Like, if you're still angry about how your church handled COVID, I pray that the Lord will work on your heart. Okay? All right, moving on. Verse 3, we come into something a little bit different. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. Now, it doesn't matter if this is a Christian ruler or not. God has put him in that place, right? Now, can rulers abuse their authority? Oh, yeah, they can, and that's a problem. But ideally, as the way that God sets up government, the government is to care for people the way that a father would care for a family, all right? But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. The government is given rights in the same way that parents are given rights to punish those in their care if they are doing what is wrong. And yes, that includes corporal punishment. Yes, in the case of our government, that does allow for the execution of those who have been rightly convicted of heinous crimes, okay? So it's not to be used all the time, nor are we commanded to do that in a New Testament era. Execution, capital punishment, is not commanded to us, but it is available to us. And I would argue, just my own personal thing here, that I would argue that the more sparingly we use it, the better. However, there are clear cases where it is necessary, particularly where the incarceration of an individual would probably endanger the lives of others. So if you have a person who is in prison for life, they're never getting out, they know that, and they're a violent individual, and they're going to kill their fellow inmates, I believe that's wrong. Those inmates' lives have value, even as convicted criminals, okay? We're not going to say, well, that's less one they have to worry about. What a harsh and cold-hearted person you have to be to come to that conclusion. I do believe that another inmate who's also incarcerated for life should have his life protected, right? I do not want to see his life ended either. So if this person is going to continue to murder other people in prison, that's a problem. And yeah, we could incarcerate him, keep him in solitary and all of that, but you know what? Their capital punishment exists for a reason, and sometimes it has to be done to protect the life of other people. Guards also, right? It does send a message. So where atrocities are punished by capital punishment, it sends a message that's straight out of the Old Testament. We see that, and people say, "Well, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to suffer that." Can that be taken too far? Yeah, absolutely. So don't misunderstand me. While I say that capital punishment is allowable, I do not believe that it should be common. I do believe it's allowable, but I'd like to see us not use it at all. I wish we could accomplish everything, keep the lives of other people safe and deterring people from committing heinous crimes through other means. But I will acknowledge that capital punishment is allowable. but I think a civilized society should use it very sparingly. That's my official position. You're welcome to come and talk to me if you have a different one. But right here, we're told that he does not bear the sword in vain. So the government does have that authority. A police officer does have the authority to take your life under certain circumstances. And that's important. Because again, there's order. It's not just chaos, Wild West out there. There's an order. And that can be very difficult for our police officers. And I think they're almost superhuman in their ability to determine a threat to their life very quickly, because simple traffic stops for a broken taillight turn into gun battles because the person inside is off their meds or had a bad day or just hates people and wants to kill cops. It's superhuman what they have to do. And so I do believe that they deserve our support. So again, that's just my little soapbox. Here we go. All right. If you have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is good. You will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. What about those who get away from the authorities? Well, God reminds us that he is the ultimate judge, and he sees all. So even if you get away with it in this life, all those unsolved crimes, guess what? God saw them. He knows who did it. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. God does have wrath. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also, for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So, we are meant to be subjects of the governing authorities. Okay, again, there's an order to our society, not only because God wants it that way, but also because it serves as a curb. That's the first use of God's law. The three uses are curb, mirror, and ruler. The curb acts, well, like the same way it does out there. If you're driving your car and you're distracted or you're falling asleep and you get too close to the curb, it's going to rub on your tire. It's going to shake you up and try to push you back on the right path. God's law does that. If the only reason I don't kill my neighbor and hide him under my porch is because God said not to, the law of God is doing its job, okay? I hope there's other reasons why I'm not going to kill my neighbor and hide him under my porch. But if the only reason that I don't do something bad is because God said not to, God's law and the fear of eternal punishment is enough. God's law is doing what it's supposed to do. On top of that, there's temporal punishments that God metes out in order to try to correct our behavior through those governing authorities. It starts with the parents who put us in timeout or slap our hands, who wash our mouths out with soap if they have to, those sorts of things in order to correct our behavior and keep us on the straight and narrow path to success and kindness and all those things we want our children to be. The same thing happens in the church. There's church discipline. Matthew 18, your pastor can put you under church discipline. The elders of the church can discipline people in that church for spiritual crimes, as it were. All right, if you're spouting off some heresy like Jesus is not Lord, your pastor can come and say, until you come back around to an orthodox understanding of this from the scriptures, I'm not going to let you commune. And if you still persist in that, Jesus is the one who says, treat this person as an unbeliever, have nothing to do with them, right? So there is an order, there is a punishment, there is this government within the church. And then, of course, we've been talking about societal issues, societal punishments, governments in states, localities, and nations that accomplish the same thing, all right? But God has set all this up. Has it corrupted at times? Do parents abuse their authority? Yeah. Do pastors abuse their authority? Yeah. Do governments and police officers, can they abuse their authority? Yeah. Why? Because guess what? They're all sinners and they're going to do that. But having it is better than not having it. And that's why God leaves it in place for us, even after the fall into sin. You'll notice in the Genesis account that when Adam and Eve are first created and there is no sin, there is no real order there other than that Adam was created first and then Eve. But there's nothing that describes their relationship. There was a true equality, a perfect pairing, as it were, right? It's only after the fall into sin that God says to Eve, your desire shall be for your husband and he will rule over you, meaning that he will be in authority over you. Why does God do this? Well, because now that sin has entered the picture, man and woman aren't going to be on the same page all the time, okay? And for the sake of the children that God will give them, somebody is going to need to be responsible when mom and dad disagree, okay? This is my Niagara Falls illustration, right? Imagine a lazy river. You all think of a lazy river? Imagine a family of 4 in a little inner tube going down, having a great day. But then they hear this rushing sound and they realize that, hey, there's a waterfall up there, right? And that if they don't make a decision to get off of that lazy river, they're going to go over Niagara Falls and probably all die. And mom says, let's all paddle this way. Dad says, no, we're closer. Let's all paddle this way. And the kids go, let's go that way, right? And while they're arguing about that, they're just getting closer and closer to death, okay? Someone needs to be responsible and someone needs to take command. Somebody needs to be in authority. So God sets that order, okay? But then on top of that, he also says, well, the husband and father is the man of the house and he is the head of the family, and all those words that modern people don't like to hear. He also says, fathers, you are to love your wife and by extension, the children that you will gain through her as Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her. It's a sacrificial love, okay? So God understands that sin is going to cause chaos in a family, and he needs to put order on that. And so he adds that order after the fall into sin, particularly for the safety of the family, and by extension, the safety of society, because we're not going to live together in peace and tranquility anymore. So we need to have an authority over us that's responsible for us. So everything in this chapter flows out of the fourth commandment, and it's a result of God putting order on chaos because of our sin. When he talks about paying taxes, you might say, hey, that sounds a lot like what Jesus said in Matthew 22. The Pharisees, this is Matthew 22:15, the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples along with the Herodians, saying, so the Herodians, the Jewish, named after the Jewish king, right? We just heard about Herod and Herodias this past Sunday, if you're on the 3-year lectionary series with the beheading of John the Baptist. So there's these government, Jewish government and Roman government kind of in conflict in Jesus' time. And so they ask him, teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion. Boy, are they buttering him up, for you're not swayed by appearances. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Are you a rebel? Are you going to lead a revolution? Are you going to do this, or are you going to betray your Jewish heritage by saying, "Oh yeah, let's pay taxes to Caesar," even though God said not to, right? God said, you're your own nation, blah blah blah. Like they had their own interpretation of what it meant to be the chosen people and what they thought that meant for their occupancy under Rome. Okay, so they're trying to trap him. Which are you going to betray? Can we get you as being a rebel and report you to the Roman authorities, or are we going to get you to say, "Oh no, I'm a good Roman citizen," and thereby alienate all the Jews and Hebrews that are listening to you? So they thought they had him in a trap. But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites?" He said, "Show me the coin for the tax." They brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." And then he said to them, and this is important, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Pay your taxes, basically. He said, "Also be faithful to God." When they heard it, they marveled, they left him and went away. Okay? So Jesus here essentially says that you should pay taxes to the government. Who was that government? Well, this is what boggles my mind. That Paul is writing to Romans about paying taxes. He's repeating Jesus' words about paying taxes to Caesar. People in Rome would have been particularly aware of what the government was like, because it's the center of Roman government, of course. And who were those governors? Well, at the time of Jesus, it was Tiberius, and he was reigning from 14 AD to 37 AD. So if Jesus is preaching and teaching around 33 AD, this is the emperor that they're aware of. And Tiberius, I guess, wasn't all that bad, from what I understand. But after him came some people that you might recognize through names. After Tiberius, there was Caligula. And after Caligula, there was Claudius. And after Claudius came Nero. So Nero, right? Caligula and Nero were shortly after. So Caligula was 37 AD to 41, and then Nero was 54 to 68. Nero's probably the emperor that Paul appealed to, or was in the process of appealing to, before Nero committed suicide at the age of 30. After a lot of this stuff about Nero, it's been questioned as to whether or not happened, because he's been painted as this terrible thing. But there's enough in the ancient histories to say he probably did a lot of these terrible, terrible, awful things. Probably he murdered most of his family. He raped his own brother. He kicked his pregnant wife to death, and then had a teenage boy castrated and then married him. And made him pretend to be his wife. All kinds of weird stuff. This is a corrupt guy. Caligula also was very corrupt in a lot of ways. And so this is the government that Paul and Jesus are saying, hey, you got to pay taxes to them. You just because they're awful, despicable people doesn't mean that you can absent yourself from paying taxes. And that brings us to another point of what does it mean for the Christian to pay taxes to a corrupt government that's going to use that money for nefarious purposes? By extension, what does it mean to patronize a business who contributes to causes that you don't agree with morally? Are you guilty by association? I would say no, because what they do with their profits is their responsibility, not yours. At the same time, if it causes you a measure of conscience, a problem of your conscience, and there are viable alternatives, obviously you can't pay taxes to a different country, but you could shop at a different store. If you know that these people are big supporters of a cause that you do not agree with, there's probably another store in your area that doesn't do that. All right. But even so, if you had to buy gas from those people, or you had to buy food from those people, you're not complicit in their sin. So this comes from John 17, when Jesus is praying to his Father. It's his high priestly prayer. He's asking his Father to take care of his disciples, and by extension, all those who believe in him. That includes us. And he says, I am coming to you, and saying Jesus is coming to the Father. These things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world. We are not of the world. We do not subscribe to the same things that the world subscribes to. We do not value, think, deal with others the way that the world does. We are different. All right? Because Jesus is not of the world. He comes from outside of it. Our world is sinful. Jesus is holy. All of that sort of stuff. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they may be sanctified in the truth. Jesus will also pray that we're not taken out of this world, but that we're kept from the evil one. So this is where the statement of that we are in the world, but not of the world comes from, meaning that we belong to a God who is totally different in terms of his will and his virtues, his attributes, his desires, than what we experience in the world, because everything we experience is corrupt, which is why Christians seem so weird to a world around them, all right? Which is why Christian values run contrary to what's popular in the world around them, okay? You're starting to get it. We run counterculturally to what is around us because we don't belong here. We belong to the world that is yet to come, where everything is set right, everything is good and holy and all of that. Sin has no place. But until we're there, we're going to seem weird while we're here, okay? So we are in the world, but we are not of the world. That means that if we partake and we deal with things that are of the world, as long as we understand that we are different and we don't buy into the way they look at it, we are free to partake of these things. So I can buy gasoline from a company that doesn't share my faith, right? I can get coffee from a place that uses their money to fund something that I don't like. Okay. I'm not complicit in that. At the same time, if I have an option to go to a coffee place that supports something that I like or that I know is indifferent, well, maybe that's how I make my choice. Okay. But I'm not so concerned about their sin rubbing off on me, as it were. All right. Let me be concerned about my own sin and my own priorities, my own values, and all of that. Okay. So we as Christians have a freedom to use the things of the world as long as we do not become like the things of this world. Important distinction comes from the scripture. Jesus talks about it in John 17, and we get littered out through the New Testament and many other places. Okay. Pay to all what is owed them. Taxes, we understand taxes. Revenue, so if we borrow money to somebody or we buy something from them, pay your bills. And then we have respect, to whom respect is owed. It's not just about our money and material possessions, it's also how we treat others. Honor, to whom honor is owed. One of the places where this comes to bear most explicitly is when Paul then writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5, and he talks about pastors. So again, pastors are meant to be spiritual fathers and act that way in a house. And so because they have that authority, it also comes with the respect from others. And if you ever attend an installation of a pastor, you will see those questions and promises that are put to the congregation to obey and honor this pastor. And the pastor then is called to serve and care for the people like a parent would. That's the exchange that happens at every installation of a pastor to a congregation. Paul writes to Timothy, let the elders, and here the elders that we're talking about are those spiritual people who oversee the lives of others. So it's really talking about pastors here. The words that we use are difficult in the New Testament to suss out pastors from non-ordained male leaders of a congregation. But we're talking about pastors here because who they rule well, they preach and teaching and preaching and teaching. So that's their labor. So we're definitely talking about pastors. And Paul says, let those who do this work be worthy of double honor. Okay. So not only give them honor, but then give them a second helping of honor. All right. Because of the work that they do. Scripture says you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. You have to pay your pastors because they labor on behalf of you, and we don't have opportunity to do another job, and we still have to pay bills, all of that sort of stuff. So that's an important thing that God sets up the order for his church, okay, and for even now. And those who persist in sin, rebuke them. 19, this is an interesting verse. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So one of Satan's favorite things to do to any church is to start rumors about the leaders of that church, whether that is, if you don't have a pastor, the elders or your president of the congregation or anything like that. And then, of course, when you do have clergy, they are the subject to a lot of attacks verbally, usually behind closed doors, little meetings after Bible class and conversations in the parking lot or over lunch that can't be answered by the person who's being accused. So the devil likes to foment those rumors and get them going and has destroyed congregations through that. And so Paul is warning the church and Timothy to be aware of that. And he actually says, you're not even supposed to believe anything that you hear about leaders in the church unless there's a corroboration of 2 or 3 witnesses, eyewitnesses to the event. So if somebody tells you, well, Pastor so-and-so was very rude to me and told me that I should go stick my head in an oven, okay? If you're hearing that gossip, one, you should remember the 8th commandment and be like, you know what? I don't want to hear this gossip. The person you're accusing is not here to defend themselves, so please keep it to yourself. That probably is not going to happen because nobody really does that. So then the next thing is to make your ears a tomb, Luther says. Bury that information you received 6 feet down. Okay, don't spread it to anybody. Don't go, oh man, that's terrible. How did you deal with it? Like, just go, oh, okay, well, you know what? Maybe he had a bad day. Okay, explain everything in the kindest way. 8th commandment, right? All right. So now if you have 2 or 3 other people that come and say, you know what, our pastor really is rude and he's been telling everyone to stick their head in an oven, then you have something that may need to be addressed. But if it's just one person telling you after Bible class, um, no, don't even listen to it. Don't even register it, Paul says, if there's not 2 or 3 other witnesses. If we did that, man, churches would be much harder to tear down and the devil wouldn't have a foothold. But hardly anybody does that. And so rumors, particularly about your clergy and your church leadership, will persist because the devil knows that's an easy way to destroy the work that God is doing in a specific place. So be very careful and work against it where you can, okay? If you want your church to be happy, healthy, and here, because you need it, right? So we have all that. Let's go back to Romans 13. So respect, honor, we're to give those things in addition to our taxes and also to pay our bills, all right? Now, the second part of chapter 13 shifts a little bit, but it plays on what we just talked about. Verse 8, owe no one anything except love. Love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Now, you think about the law, think about 10 commandments first, although there are different types of laws. We'll talk about those in a bit, maybe, if I can remember to come back to it. We'll talk about the commandments. If you honor your father and mother, okay, yeah, you're loving your neighbor as yourself. If you are not killing your neighbor, that's a version to love your neighbor. If you're not sleeping with your neighbor who's not your spouse, that's a way to love your neighbor as well. Not destroying their reputation, not trying to get their goods, all right? If you're doing all that, you're fulfilling the law. Of course, we know from our earlier studies in Romans that no one is capable of doing that. Not perfectly, not as the perfection that God demands. So we will fall short in breaking the law all the time. So Paul has already said if we can do the law, we would live by it, but we can't do it. So that's why we need someone who can. That's what Jesus does. Jesus is perfect. He keeps the law of God. He honored his father and mother. We see that especially after his being left behind in Jerusalem when he was 12. We're told that he went back to Nazareth. He went home with Mary and Joseph, and Luke tells us he was submissive to them, meaning that even though he's the king of the universe, when his dad said, Jesus, I need you to take out the trash, man, Jesus didn't go, oh, yeah, I'll get to it sometime and then not do it. He took out the trash, right? Jesus was submissive. So we see that. He's even submissive to the Roman authorities when they unjustly convict him and order his execution. He says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my disciples would be fighting. He says to Peter, after he cuts off Malchus's ear in the garden, do you not think that I could talk to my father and he would send more than 12 legions of angels to help me? He's like, I am submissive to this, even though it is unjust. Okay? So Jesus is modeling the life that we are to have as Christians in this world, but we'll never measure up. That's why Jesus is there. Okay? All right. You shall not commit adultery. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Do you know that golden rule, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, isn't here in the New Testament? It's actually from the Old. The Old Testament, the first mention of you shall love your neighbor as yourself is actually way back in Leviticus 19:18, I think it is. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord, right there. So Leviticus chapter 18:19. It's surrounded by other types of laws. So we would say that no one would say that we should disregard the love your neighbor as yourself. Everybody loves the golden rule, right? But we also have a repetition of the commandments here. You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another, you shall not rob your neighbor. All of that's part of the moral law. But here, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. My grandfather, who was a farmer in Wisconsin, often had standing corn near the end. And I would say, Grandpa, why don't you go and chop that down? And he says, oh, well, the Bible said that that's for the sojourner and the poor. I'm like, nobody's coming out to pick that. I think it was really just that when he turned the harvester, it didn't get all the way to the edge. He's like, it's not worth going out, and because he'll get it when he turns it all under the next season. But he knew his Bible well enough. He was a faithful Lutheran guy. Went to Bible study all the time. Not a man of many words, but said, yeah, well, the Bible tells me not to do that. Well, so that's a difference in the type of laws. So there's the moral law, there's a civil law, and there's a ceremonial law. I have this kind of thing here: moral, ceremonial, and civic. Moral law is what governs our behavior. And it's the only type of the three laws in the Old Testament that are maintained in the New Testament. Jesus upholds them and he actually extends them. Like, instance, murder. He says, you have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I tell you, if you're angry with your brother in your heart, you've already committed the sin of murder. Jesus extends the commandments, the moral law, to not only what you do, but also what you think about. Okay? So the moral law is upheld. Love your neighbor as yourself is part of that moral conduct, and therefore it's still binding upon Christians today. However, the ceremonial law that covers like how many turtle doves you are to offer if you've lied to your parents, or how many goats you have to repay your neighbor if you've stole one, those sorts of things, or sorry, I'm mixing the two already. Ceremonial is how many turtle doves you'd offer for your sin of lying to your parents. The civil law would be if you stole your neighbor's goat, how many goats you had to repay them with, sevenfold, and then plus the value of the one you stole, or something like that. Those two sets of laws, the ceremonial and the civil, that governed how Israel was to worship and how they were to live together under their kings or their judges or whatever the form of government was at the time, those were fulfilled. Jesus even broke some of those laws in the New Testament, and that gets him into trouble with the Pharisees, who say, well, why is he not washing his hands before he does this, that sort of thing? Why is he talking to this Samaritan woman? Those aren't even really laws. They're just social norms by that point. But those three types of laws are separate. So a lot of times you'll hear people give you criticism about if you hold to an unpopular moral standard to today's society, and you say that you do that because the Bible says that this is wrong, people who think they're knowledgeable about the Bible will say, well, yeah, but you know what the Bible also says? It talks about, like, you shall not let your cattle interbreed, and that you can't wear clothing of two different fabrics, right? So you're picking and choosing which laws out of the Old Testament you want to follow, right? So let's see. Here's one of the things that I find interesting. If we go to Leviticus 19, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Nobody would say that we shouldn't do that, right? And it's couched into adultery. It's surrounded by a lot of prohibitions against sexual sins and child sacrifice, punishments for sexual immorality, okay? Let's go back. If you go to Leviticus 17, or no, it's Leviticus 18. Come on here. Unlawful sexual relations, okay? Incest is in here, okay? All kinds of stuff. All right. So in between these prohibitions against homosexuality, abortion, incest, all things that society is trying to normalize today, we have this love your neighbor as yourself. The golden rule that everybody would say, oh yeah, that we should do is set in this context of other moral laws. All right. Yes, there are some things mixed in about like the civil law, okay, and the ceremonial law. But when you understand that there is a difference between these types of laws, then it makes sense. So don't buy into that if somebody tells you you're picking and choosing which laws you want to follow. They don't have the first clue about Old Testament history and the three types of laws that Israel was under, nor do they understand that Jesus in the New Testament upheld the moral law, which is one of the reasons why Christians still talk about the Ten Commandments, but we don't talk about how many turtle doves you have to offer if you lied to your parents, okay? Just when people do that, they just reveal their ignorance, all right? So don't be ignoramus, okay? All right. So, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Duh, right? And if we could all do that, that would be great. But we can't. And so we're going to sin against each other. So we're going to continue to need forgiveness. Now we have this warning right here at the end, okay? Besides this, you know the time, and the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. You're different than the world around you. Quit living like the world around you matters this way, right? You're trying to live in both worlds, and it's not working, people, right? For salvation is nearer to us now than we first believed. This is a reference to Jesus coming again to judge the living and the dead. They believed that Jesus was coming soon. We're told that all Christians should believe that and should be watchful for that and should live that way. And then Paul gives here a perception that with every day that goes past, we are closer to that heavenly existence, that new heavens and the new earth where we inhabit, where everything is set right. And so live like that's coming next Tuesday, kind of a thing. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. That contrast between the works of darkness and the works of light, that's all through the scriptures, okay? Interestingly enough, a lot of the crime and a lot of sin that we would commit, we do so in dark, whether that's a dark room, whether that's the darkness of night, whether that's the darkness of the eyes of other people, that there's nobody looking. We think that we get away with it if it's dark, that nobody can see us. Of course, God can see us, right? So that contrast between dark and light is all through the scriptures. Christians are called to live in the light of Christ, live in the light of what is holy and right, live in the light of what God reveals is true and right and the proper way to do things. That's how we are to live and not give things for the darkness. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. Let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies or drunkenness, common things in Rome, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, common things in Rome, not in quarreling and jealousy, common things everywhere, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ. So be covered with Jesus Christ. Try to follow his example. You won't be able to do it. Then remember that his righteousness covers over yours and he forgives your sins. Correct? Then try again the next time. Make no provision to the flesh to gratify its desires. You will be tempted. You'll recognize that you'll be tempted. Resist. Sometimes you will be successful through prayer, through distraction, through getting up and going somewhere else. People. Okay. Let me find here. Number one, if you find that you're being tempted to do something that you know is wrong, you have that moment. I want to do this. Ooh, I know that's wrong. Ooh, but I want to do this. Get up and move. It's one of the easiest ways to fight temptation. Get out of that room. Get out of that conversation. Get out of that space. Go somewhere else, particularly in the light or with other people. And you'll find that that temptation went away. Okay? Not always, but it's like the number one thing. Just get up and move away, right? Prayer, obviously. Fasting, we're told, can help with spiritual discipline. All those sorts of things. Reading your scripture. Yes, all good things. Great things to combat temptation. But I would say the immediate number one thing you can do to combat temptation is to get up and leave. If you're being finding that you're sinning in church while you're sitting there, and you see Edna over there, and you just can't stand her, so you're thinking about all these bad things that happened to her instead of listening to the pastor. You say, well, should I leave church? Dude, you're not in church. Your mind is elsewhere. So why not get up from your seat, go to the back, go out to the narthex, get a drink of water, come back and sit down and see if that helps. Don't absent yourself from church, obviously. Don't do that. But a little bit of movement can often have a big impact in how we're being tempted. So get yourself out of that situation, take a break, come back to it later, or find something else to do, right? Because you want to hear the word. But man, if you're finding yourself in a situation where you're thinking about something and just can't get it out of your head, get out of your room, get away from your desk, get out of your bed, go somewhere else, right? And see if that doesn't change things. So a little bit of tip on combating temptation. But you're going to fall to it from time to time. It'll happen every day. And that's when you remember that you're covered with Christ. right? His righteousness covers over yours. He forgives your sins. You can come to confession and absolution. You can come to the sacrament and know that he does forgive those sins. And then you go back out into the fight tomorrow. And that's the Christian life. Falling down, confessing, and getting back into the fight for tomorrow. For the moral law, not the civil, not the ceremonial, none of that. Okay? And this life is hard when you're surrounded, when you're in the world and you're surrounded by all these things, right? Sensuality, quarreling, orgies, drunkenness, when that's all going on constantly, it's hard not to be influenced by it. Again, that's why church attendance is so important, because you're around people who believe and profess and struggle the same way that you do. And so it's kind of a refreshment to go back out there and fight in the world around you. So to sum up Romans 13, God establishes order in the family, in the church, and in society. He calls us to obey that order as long as they do not cause us to sin or command us to sin. Let me rephrase it that way. All right, so we're obeying the government authorities unless they command us to commit sin, and then we obey God rather than men. All of that, all the authority on earth extends from the fourth commandment, which is the first government that we have in the family. There needs to be order because of sin. Shouldn't fear the government if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, if you don't do wrong. But God does establish punishment for wrongdoing, both eternally and temporally. And we're not going to get away from that. If we're going to be honorable, we need to pay our bills, and we need to also protect the reputation of those people who are in authority over us. That is one of the reasons why you should speak well of your parents. You should speak well of your pastors or church leadership. You should speak well of your police, and you should speak well of your judges, your magistrates, and your people in government, senators, all the way up to the president, even if you didn't vote for him. I know it's difficult if you didn't get your guy in there, but there is no authority on earth except what God has established. Even if he is a rogue, even if he's a Nero, God is still doing something through him. And he demands and commands that we show honor the same way we would to our parents. Tough to hear, especially now we're in election season, but it's right there in Romans 13. Okay? So ponder all that. Reminder to try to love each other as God has loved you. It's an impossible task, but again, we try, we fail, we confess and repent, and then we go back out into the fight the next day. That's the life. May God be with you on your journey. Thank you for studying along with me, and God willing, I'll see you next Wednesday, and we'll tackle chapter 14. Thank you, and goodbye.